At 7:42 on May 27, 1940, Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the French village of Lepanet, watching 5 German soldiers advance through the morning mist toward his position. He was 33 years old. It had been 14 years since he graduated from Sandhurst. He had 0 confirmed kills in combat. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 miles per day, and the entire British expeditionary force was running for the sea. Churchill's company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, and better coordination. British soldiers were dying by the hundreds along every road leading to Dunkirk. The retreat had become a rout. Officers burned classified documents in ditches. Sergeants buried equipment they could not carry. Privates threw away rifles just to run faster toward the coast. But Jack Churchill was not running. He was carrying a 6-foot English longbow with a draw weight of 70 pounds and an effective range of 200 yards in the hands of an expert archer. And Churchill was an expert. Just 11 months earlier, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, placing 26th out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a world champion, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. The German patrol was now at 30 yards. Close enough. Churchill could see the sergeant leading them, a veteran by the look of his careful movements, probably a man who had fought through the Polish campaign. The sergeant was scanning the hedges and windows, looking for standard threats, rifles, machine guns, grenades. He never thought to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The yew wood creaked under the tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor point on the string, the same position he had used 10,000 times in practice. He had made this exact shot countless times at targets. He had never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons obsolete. The British Army never quite knew what to do with Jack Churchill. He graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He spent a decade learning to be a conventional infantry officer. Then, in 1936, he quit the army entirely because peacetime soldiering bored him to exhaustion. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. He appeared in films as an archer and bagpipe player, including a small role in The Thief of Baghdad. He rode motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India, once crashing into a water buffalo on a rural road. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment. But he did not rejoin as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same weapon he had used in international competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier. And he brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best and unstable at worst. His commanding officers considered him a potential liability. The War Office had no regulations covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill did not care. He had studied military history extensively. He knew that modern rifles were more accurate than longbows at long range. He knew that a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow could loose perhaps 10. But he also knew something that tacticians in London had forgotten. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, Psychological warfare mattered as much as raw firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword and a Highland war cry was more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even knew he was there had an advantage that no amount of modern technology could match. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th, 1940. Most left behind their weapons, vehicles, equipment, and pride. They came home defeated and exhausted, expecting a German invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered his company's retreat. He had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in a museum, and he was just getting started. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit that the War Office was quietly forming. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would be brutal, beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would be suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. Casualties were expected to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. By December 1941, he would be leading men onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn, bagpipes screaming into the Arctic wind, broadsword raised above his head, about to prove that sometimes the oldest ways of war were still the deadliest. The British Commandos were born from desperation. In June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The army had lost most of its equipment at Dunkirk. An invasion seemed imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force that could strike back at the enemy, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. The concept was simple and ruthless. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would raid the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy facilities, kill Germans, gather intelligence, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The missions would be dangerous. The training would be even harder. Volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered immediately. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and threw himself into the training program. The Commandos trained in Scotland, in the mountains around Achnacarry Castle. They marched 30 miles a day carrying full equipment. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned to kill silently with knives, garrots, and bare hands. They fired live ammunition over each other's heads during exercises. Men who could not keep up were sent back to their original units in disgrace. Churchill excelled at everything. He was older than most volunteers, but stronger and more determined. He could march longer, shoot straighter, and fight harder than men 10 years younger. And he brought skills no other commando possessed. He could put an arrow into a target at 200 yards. He could play the bagpipes while marching into battle. He could handle a broadsword with the ease of a medieval knight. At first, the other commandos did not know what to make of him. Some thought he was showing off. Others thought he was genuinely insane. But as training progressed, they began to understand his logic. Churchill did not carry ancient weapons because he believed they were superior to modern firearms. He carried them because war was about more than killing. War was about psychology. War was about fear. A German soldier facing a rifle knew what to expect. He had trained against rifles. He understood the threat. But a German soldier facing a screaming madman with a sword and bagpipes had no training for that. His mind would freeze for a critical second while he tried to process what he was seeing. And in combat, a second of hesitation meant death. By autumn 1941, Churchill had been promoted to second in command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had conducted several small raids along the Norwegian coast, but nothing major. Then, in November, orders arrived from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3 Commando would lead a major assault on the German garrison at Vegsøy, a small island on the Norwegian coast. The operation was codenamed Archery. The target was strategically important. WWII controlled access to a network of fjords used by German ships transporting iron ore from Sweden. The island housed a garrison of about 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, and an anti-aircraft battery. The town of South WWII contained fish oil factories producing glycerin for explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy. Cruisers would bombard German positions. Royal Air Force bombers would provide air cover. Then the commandos would land on multiple beaches simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize. Churchill studied the intelligence reports obsessively. The German garrison was well-trained and well-equipped. They had machine guns, mortar, and prepared defensive positions. The coastal artillery could sink landing craft before they reached the beach. The attack had to be fast, violent, and overwhelming. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto WWII Island, a small fortified position guarding the approach to South WWII. Permission was granted. He requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission was again granted, though several senior officers openly questioned his sanity. On the night before the raid, Churchill checked his equipment one final time. His broadsword was sharp. His bagpipes were tuned. He had grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun as backup. But his plan was to lead the charge with steel and music, not bullets. The commandos boarded their transports on Christmas Day, 1941. They sailed north through the Arctic darkness, past the coast of Scotland into the Norwegian Sea. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the railings. The men huddled in cramped quarters, checking weapons, writing letters home, trying not to think about what was coming. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps and rehearsing signals with his men. He had 105 commandos under his direct command. Their objective was to neutralize the German shore battery on WWII within 10 minutes of landing. If they failed, the entire operation could collapse. German artillery would destroy the following landing craft. Hundreds of British soldiers might die in the freezing water. At 8:45 on December 27th, the transports reached their launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. Landing craft were lowered into black, icy water. The commandos climbed down cargo nets in full combat gear. Churchill took his place in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, sword at his belt. In 90 minutes, he would either be dead or legendary. The landing craft, carrying Churchill and his men, approached WWII through a curtain of smoke. RAF Hampton bombers had dropped smoke canisters along the shoreline to blind German gunners. The cruiser HMS Kenya fired salvos at the shore battery, 6-inch guns thundering across the fjord. Explosions lit the Norwegian coast like lightning. Churchill stood in the bow, fully exposed. The other commandos crouched behind the steel gunwales, but their commander remained upright. The shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. At 8:48, the ramp of Churchill's landing craft dropped onto the rocky beach of WWII Island. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped into the freezing surf and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound of the bagpipes cut through explosions and gunfire like a knife through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound imaginable, echoing across a Nazi-occupied Norwegian beach. German soldiers in the shore battery heard it and could not believe their ears. They had been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades, not to face a man calmly walking toward their guns while playing ancient war music. Churchill finished the tune, set down his pipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, shouting for his men to follow. The commandos surged behind him, firing Thompsons and Enfields. The Germans tried to respond, but were disorganized and confused, still trying to understand what was happening. The assault on WWII took less than 10 minutes. Churchill led his men through the German positions systematically, clearing bunkers and gun emplacements one by one. The 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun and captured. The German commander was taken prisoner, along with 15 of his men. Those who resisted were killed. Those who surrendered were bound and sent to the beach for evacuation. Churchill was everywhere during the assault, appearing at the front of every attack, sword in hand, directing his men with shouts and hand signals. Close-quarters combat was brutal and fast. By 9 o'clock, Maclay was secure. Then came word from South Vigsy. The main assault force was meeting heavy resistance. German reinforcements had arrived overnight, and the garrison was larger than expected. Street fighting raged in the town center. Casualties were mounting. Churchill gathered his remaining men and commandeered a landing craft to cross the narrow strait to South Vigsy. When he landed, he found chaos. German snipers fired from windows and rooftops. Machine gun nests covered the main streets. British commandos were pinned down, unable to advance. Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, the overall commander, needed Churchill's men to break the deadlock. Churchill deployed his commandos immediately. He personally led a flanking attack down a side street, sword drawn, moving from cover to cover. The Germans fell back under pressure, unable to hold their positions against attackers coming from multiple directions. The battle for South Vigsy lasted into the afternoon. The commandos systematically cleared the town building by building, room by room. They demolished the fish oil factories with explosives. They captured German documents and codebooks. Over 100 prisoners were taken. Victory came at a cost. 17 British commandos were killed and 53 wounded. Churchill emerged without a scratch. His sword was stained with blood. His bagpipes were intact. His reputation was now legendary. The raid on Vigsy was the first major commando success of the war. It proved that small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. It showed that aggressive tactics and psychological shock could overcome fortified positions. And it demonstrated that Jack Churchill's medieval methods were not madness. They worked. The German High Command was furious. Hitler ordered coastal defenses across Norway strengthened. 30,000 additional troops were diverted to garrison duty along the Norwegian coast troops that might otherwise have fought in Russia or North Africa. A single raid by roughly 300 commandos had tied down an entire army. Word of Churchill's exploits spread through the British military. Newspapers ran stories about the officer who played bagpipes into battle and charged with a broadsword. Commanders requested him for their operations. The War Office stopped questioning his unusual equipment. By summer 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. His next missions would take him to the beaches of Sicily, the mountains of Italy, and the most audacious prisoner capture of the entire war. 42 Germans were about to learn that surrendering to a man with a sword was better than dying on it. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. 160,000 troops from Britain, America, and Canada landed on the island's southern coast within the first 3 days. The objective was to knock Italy out of the war and open a new front against Germany. No. 2 Commando landed at Catania on Sicily's eastern coast under Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill. He came ashore with his full arsenal, Scottish broadsword at his waist, longbow and arrows slung across his back, bagpipes tucked under his arm. His men no longer questioned his choices. They had seen what he could do in Norway. They trusted him completely. Fighting in Sicily was brutal. The Germans had reinforced Italian troops with elite paratroopers and panzer divisions. Villages became fortresses. Roads became ambush sites. The Allies advanced slowly, taking casualties at every step. Churchill led his commandos through mountainous terrain, bypassing strong points, striking supply lines, and gathering intelligence on German positions. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies prepared to invade mainland Italy. The plan called for landings at Salerno, south of Naples. Intelligence suggested the Germans expected an attack farther north near Rome. The beaches at Salerno were believed to be lightly defended. The intelligence was wrong. No, two commando landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943, and immediately encountered fierce resistance. The Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced the area with panzers and artillery. The beachhead came under heavy fire within hours. American and British troops were pinned down, unable to advance. The entire operation was in danger. Churchill's commandos were ordered to defend a critical road and rail junction at the town of Vitry sul Mare, overlooking the western half of the Bay of Salerno. If the Germans captured Vitry, they could pour artillery fire onto the beaches and possibly destroy the landing force. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vitry against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, ditches, and rubble. They repelled infantry assaults and tank probes. They called in naval gunfire on German positions. They refused to yield, even as ammunition ran low and casualties increased. On the night of September 14th, Churchill received new orders. German forces had occupied hills above the town of Molina, controlling a strategic pass that led down to the Salerno beachhead. An observation post in those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. It had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the ground. A frontal assault up the hills would be suicidal. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach and mortar zeroed on obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and destroyed before reaching the objective. He chose a different approach. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions at night. 2 men could move where 200 could not. 2 men could capture what 200 might not take by force. They left the British lines after midnight. Moving through darkness, they used terrain for cover, crawled through drainage ditches, and slipped along stone walls. German sentries were avoided one by one. The night was black. The Germans were not expecting 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Churchill saw the glow of cigarettes in the dark. German soldiers manned a mortar position, relaxed and unworried. Churchill drew his broadsword and approached silently. He appeared out of the darkness like a ghost from another century. The Germans surrendered immediately. They had never seen anything like this calm officer with a medieval weapon. Churchill used his revolver lanyard as a rope to link the first prisoner and lead him to the next position. He repeated the process again and again approached silently, appear suddenly, demand surrender. Each time, the Germans complied. Shock and disbelief overcame resistance. By dawn, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar section. They marched their prisoners back down the path to British lines. Wounded Germans were placed on carts and pushed by their comrades. Churchill later described the scene as something from the Napoleonic Wars. He received the Distinguished Service Order for his actions at Molina. The citation praised his courage, initiative, and leadership. It did not mention that he had accomplished the entire capture with a sword. Some details were too unusual, even for official records. The Salerno beachhead was secure. By September 20th, the Allies began their long advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. Churchill and his commandos continued operating ahead of the main forces, raiding German positions, capturing prisoners, and disrupting communications. His reputation had spread beyond the British forces. German soldiers told stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes. Some called him a madman, a berserker, a throwback to an earlier age of warfare. Some refused to believe he existed. Others hoped they would never meet him. By spring 1944, the war in Italy had bogged down into a grinding stalemate along the Gustav Line. The Allies needed new fronts to stretch German resources. Churchill received orders transferring no II Commando to Yugoslavia to support partisan fighters against German occupation. The Germans in Yugoslavia had heard stories about him long before he arrived. Intelligence reports described a British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some officers dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others believed them. None fully understood what Churchill was capable of. Yugoslavia had become one of the most brutal theaters of the war. German occupation forces controlled cities and major roads, but communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated mountains and forests. Fighting was savage. Prisoners were rarely taken. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisal attacks. Over 500,000 German troops were deployed, yet they were still losing ground. The British government decided to support Tito's partisans with weapons, supplies, and military advisors. The commandos would provide direct combat support. Churchill and II Commando were based on the island of Vis in the Adriatic from April 1944, launching raids along the Dalmatian coast. He embraced the mission with enthusiasm. He studied the terrain, learned partisan tactics, and planned operations against German supply lines. The partisans admired his aggression and willingness to fight alongside them. The Germans quickly realized that the madman with the sword had arrived in their sector. Early raids were successful. Churchill led attacks on German outposts, destroying equipment and capturing prisoners. He moved through the mountains with sword and bagpipes, inspiring partisans with his fearlessness. The Germans reinforced garrisons and increased patrols. They sensed their enemy had become more dangerous and more coordinated. In May 1944, Churchill received orders to capture the German-held island of Brac. The island controlled shipping lanes along the coast. Several hundred German soldiers held fortified positions on the hills overlooking the beaches. Churchill assembled a mixed force: 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and about 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. The British commandos were highly trained professionals. The partisans were brave, but poorly equipped and loosely disciplined. Coordinating them in a complex amphibious assault would be extremely difficult. The landing on Brac was unopposed. The Germans had pulled back from the beaches to prepared positions in the hills. Churchill landed with his men on the night of May 2, 1944. The plan called for an immediate advance toward German positions. Instead, the partisan commanders hesitated. Seeing the strength of German fortifications, they decided to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Delay gave the Germans time to reinforce, prepare, and call for support. But he could not force the partisans to move. He waited through a long night, knowing surprise had been lost. The assault began the next morning. No. 43 Commando launched a flanking attack, while Churchill led elements of No. 40 Commando in a direct assault up the slopes. The partisans stayed near the landing area, offering no meaningful support. The commandos were effectively on their own. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire raked the approaches. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing men. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, urging his men up the hill. The attack stalled. Men fell around him. Ammunition ran low. A German mortar team zeroed in on Churchill's position. They fired a salvo directly into the group of commandos gathered near their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Churchill. He survived only because he had been standing slightly apart, playing his bagpipes to encourage the attack. Suddenly he found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying. Germans were advancing. Ammunition was exhausted. Escape was impossible. He did what a man like him would do. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing Will the No Come Back Again, a Scottish lament, a song of farewell and defiance. The Germans approached cautiously. They could not believe what they were seeing. A British officer surrounded by the bodies of his men, playing music while rifles were aimed at him. They did not shoot immediately. They were too unsettled, perhaps too impressed by his composure. A grenade exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he woke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported him to Berlin for interrogation. Convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister, they hoped to extract valuable intelligence. They were disappointed. Jack Churchill had no connection to Winston Churchill and no strategic secrets. He was simply an officer with a sword and bagpipes. They sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, to a special compound for prominent prisoners. Politicians, resistance leaders, and suspected relatives of important figures. Churchill was placed among men who had plotted against Hitler and defied the regime. Many expected execution. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was an obstacle. He was placed in Sonderlager A, a special compound for high-value prisoners. Among his fellow inmates were 3 RAF officers who had participated in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft. 3 in March 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after that escape. These 3 survived only because they were considered valuable. Churchill immediately began planning his own escape. He studied the camp layout, guard routines, fences, and watchtowers. He identified weak points and recruited allies. Within weeks, he had a plan. Prisoners in Sonderlager A had access to a small garden area near the perimeter. Churchill and his conspirators began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch in that garden. They worked at night, hiding excavated dirt under compost. Using spoons, bits of metal, and bare hands, they clawed through the earth. The tunnel eventually extended about 110 meters, passing under the fence and emerging in woods beyond the perimeter. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel to freedom. They emerged in darkness outside the camp and scattered. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the Great Escape survivors. Their plan was to walk north roughly 200 kilometers to the Baltic coast and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks they moved through Nazi Germany on foot. They traveled by night, hid by day, stole vegetables from fields, and drank from streams. They avoided roads, towns, and any place where they might speak and reveal they had no German. The weather turned cold. Their clothes were thin. They had no maps, no compass, and no supplies beyond what they could steal. They came within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. A German patrol near Rostock stopped them and demanded identification. They had none. Arrest followed. Under interrogation, they were identified as escaped prisoners from Sachsenhausen. This time, Churchill was sent not back to Sachsenhausen, but to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps, far from any Allied line. By late 1944, Germany was crumbling. The Soviets advanced from the east. Allied forces drove toward the Rhine from the west. For a prisoner in an Alpine camp, liberation still seemed distant. Churchill spent the winter of 1944-45 in captivity, watching Germany collapse. Allied bombers roared overhead daily. News filtered in of Soviet advances, the fall of Berlin, and Hitler's desperate orders. Guards grew nervous and uncertain. They knew they might soon face justice. In late April 1945, Churchill and about 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred from Austria to the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS planned to use them as hostages in negotiations with advancing allies. The prisoners were marched to the mountains under guard, not knowing whether they would be released or executed. The end came unexpectedly. A delegation of prisoners approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear of being murdered by the SS. The officers listened. A German army unit, commanded by Captain Richard von Alvensleben, moved to protect the prisoners. The Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbered the SS guards. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village free, but stranded. Most waited for Allied troops. Jack Churchill did not. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had escaped once, been recaptured, and survived. He had no interest in sitting idle while there was still a war to fight. He began walking south toward Allied lines. He covered roughly 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing passes and avoiding German stragglers. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, and no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. To them, he looked like a ragged stranger claiming to be a British commando lieutenant colonel. He had no papers or insignia. He convinced them with sheer force of personality, the authority in his voice, and the stories he told of swords, bagpipes, and German prisoners captured at sword point. They sent him back to Britain through military channels. He arrived in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered. Concentration camps were being liberated. The fighting in Europe was over. The war itself was not. Japan still fought in the Pacific. British soldiers were still dying in Burma, Malaya, and across Southeast Asia. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, play his bagpipes on one more beach, and prove again that old ways of war still had meaning. The War Office approved his request. By summer 1945, Jack Churchill was on a ship heading east toward Burma and the planned invasion of Japan. He had no idea that 2 atomic bombs would change everything. Churchill was somewhere over India when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber dropped a weapon that killed around 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Churchill received the news with bitter disappointment. He had spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan. He had studied Japanese tactics and fortifications and planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with sword and bagpipes, as he had in Norway, Sicily, and Yugoslavia. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no chance to test himself against another enemy. His reaction later became famous. He reportedly remarked that, without the atomic bombs, the war could have gone on for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something true. He was a man who thrived in combat, who found meaning in chaos, who felt most alive when death was close. Peace was foreign to him. After the war, the British military did not know quite what to do with Jack Churchill. He was too aggressive for routine garrison duty, too eccentric for staff work, and too famous to ignore. His service record was extraordinary. Distinguished Service Order with bar, Military Cross with bar, multiple mentions and dispatches. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, and Yugoslavia. He had escaped from a concentration camp and captured 42 prisoners with a sword. The War Office assigned him to administrative duties in Burma, helping oversee the transition from war to peace. He found the work tedious. Paperwork held no interest. Bureaucracy had no appeal. He requested transfers to active units and volunteered for dangerous assignments, looking for any opportunity to return to the kind of soldiering he understood. By 1946, the British Empire was unraveling. India demanded independence. Palestine slid toward civil war. Colonial territories across Africa and Asia stirred with nationalism. The world he had fought to defend was changing into something unrecognizable. In 1947, Churchill was transferred to Palestine as second in command of the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry. The situation was explosive. Jewish refugees from the Holocaust flooded into the territory, seeking a homeland. Arab Palestinians resisted what they saw as an invasion. British soldiers were caught in the middle, attacked by both sides while trying to maintain order. Violence escalated through 1947 and into 1948. Jewish militant groups bombed British installations. Arab fighters ambushed Jewish convoys. Britain announced its withdrawal from Palestine, effective May 1948. Everyone knew a full-scale war was coming. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel was ambushed on the road to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The convoy carried doctors, nurses, students, and patients. Arab fighters attacked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. British security forces in the area failed to intervene effectively. 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill was not present at the attack, but he became deeply involved in the aftermath. Surviving Jewish medical staff at Hadassah Hospital were now trapped on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile territory. They could not leave safely, nor receive supplies. They faced starvation or violence. Churchill organized their evacuation. He coordinated with British military units, Jewish authorities, and Arab leaders to arrange safe passage for the trapped personnel. He personally oversaw the operation, moving through contested areas with the same calm authority he had displayed on battlefields across Europe. Around 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients were evacuated from Mount Scopus under his protection. Asked later about his approach to these dangerous negotiations, Churchill offered a typically simple explanation. People were less likely to shoot at someone who smiled at them. It was the same psychology he had applied throughout his career. Confidence, composure, and refusal to show fear could accomplish what firepower could not. Churchill left Palestine shortly before the British withdrawal in May 1948. The State of Israel was declared. The Arab-Israeli War began. The violence he had witnessed was only the opening chapter of a conflict that would continue for decades. He returned to Britain with his military career winding down. He was 41 years old. He had fought in the greatest war in history, survived wounds and captivity, and earned decorations most soldiers could scarcely imagine. He had no clear idea what to do with the rest of his life. The British Army offered training assignments, staff positions, and administrative roles. Churchill accepted them without enthusiasm. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, jumping from aircraft simply to feel adrenaline again. He trained new generations of soldiers in commando tactics, passing on the skills he had learned in Scotland and tested across Europe. Yet peacetime soldiering could never match the intensity of war. He needed something else. He found it in an unlikely place. The man who had fought with swords and longbows, who had stormed beaches with bagpipes, who had escaped Nazi camps, discovered a new passion: surfing. On July 21, 1955, a 48-year-old British officer stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England, holding a homemade surfboard and watching for the tidal bore, a wave that rolled up the river from the Bristol Channel twice a day. Local fishermen thought he was mad. They had seen the bore for generations, but no one had tried to ride it. Jack Churchill paddled into the brown water and waited. The bore appeared as a white line on the horizon, moving upstream against the current. It was not large by ocean standards, perhaps 5 feet at its peak, but it was a wave. Churchill determined to ride it. He caught the bore and surfed it for over a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly the kind of unnecessary, slightly dangerous challenge that defined his life. He was not content to watch the wave. He had to be on it, feel it under his feet, master it as he had mastered the longbow, broadsword, and bagpipes. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had served more than 30 years, fought in one world war and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations, and survived experiences that would have killed most men many times over. At 52, he was finally at peace with civilian life on his own terms. His retirement was as eccentric as his service. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model boats, building elaborate warships and sailing them on ponds near his home. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He continued to play bagpipes at memorials and regimental gatherings, a living link to the commando tradition he helped create. His daily commute became the stuff of local legend. Churchill would ride the train home from London, and as it passed his neighborhood, he would open a window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Fellow passengers thought he had gone mad. In reality, he had calculated the exact point where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. When asked about his wartime exploits, Churchill was modest. He did not boast about the Germans he had killed or the prisoners he had captured. He did not exaggerate his role or claim credit for victories that belonged to others. He simply told the truth, which was extraordinary enough. His son Malcolm later recalled that his father would discuss the war openly with anyone who asked, especially over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention. The years passed. Churchill watched the world change. The British Empire dissolved. The Cold War divided Europe. New technologies transformed warfare. Guided missiles replaced massed artillery. Jet aircraft replaced propeller planes. Nuclear weapons made conventional combat seem almost quaint. The kind of war he had fought with swords, bagpipes, and personal courage became a historical curiosity. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He outlived most of his commando comrades, most of his fellow prisoners from Sachsenhausen, and many of the men he had led into battle across Europe. He died peacefully in Surrey, England, surrounded by family, a lifetime removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. Obituaries struggled to capture his life. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. A fictional character with his story would seem unbelievable. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortar exploded around him. A man who escaped a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves, threw briefcases from trains, and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most successful commander or the most brilliant strategist. He did not win decisive battles or change the course of history through grand plans. What he did was simpler and in some ways more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one determined person could achieve what larger forces could not. His legacy lives on in the commandos he helped shape, in the special operations forces that trace their lineage to those Scottish training grounds, and in every soldier who has been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it.